Good morning and welcome to the Greater Friendship Missionary Baptist Church Sunday Church School. As the psalmist said, it is good to be in the house of the Lord one more time. My name is Reverend Ron Collier, and I will be bringing the lesson on today. The lesson comes from the book of Nehemiah, chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. The subject is Nehemiah combats derision and danger. Our teaching goal today is for behavior change, and our aim is watch and pray while you work. Watch and pray while you work. The resources used for the study come from the Union Gospel Press, Bible, Expositor, and Illuminator. Also, I used the Crossway ESV Study Bible, the Nelson King James Version Bible, the Tyndale NIV Life Application Bible, and the McCarthy Study Bible. This lesson takes place in the period following the Babylonian captivity, and after 70 years in exile, the Jews were allowed to return to their homeland in Judah, and more specifically to Jerusalem and the surrounding area. Now, today's lesson takes place approximately 100 or so years after the first return, and this is the third of three opportunities that they had for the exiles to return to their homeland. And the reason why Nehemiah returned was because he heard the news that the walls of Jerusalem had not been rebuilt, and that the people, his brethren in Jerusalem, were in great distress. And so God placed it upon his heart to do something about it. Now, he was an advisor and the cupbearer of the Persian king Artaxerxes. And in this position of authority, which he had direct access to the king. So when he heard the news about what was going on in Jerusalem, he fasted and prayed, he wept, and he mourned, and he began seeking and asking. So he was a very religious person, if you will. He was a person who was connected up to God, and he sought God for answers and to make a way for him to be able to do what he could to help his people. And who knows but that he was in such a position for such a time as this. And he was able to walk worthy of his calling, because God had placed him in that position, and he used the position that he was in to go back to Jerusalem and to help his people. And just to show you how God blessed him, the king gave him letters to legitimize what he wanted him to do, so that if anybody opposed him, he could show, well, I'm on a mission from the king of Persia. The king opened up the treasury and gave him financial resources, money to take back with him. He also gave him building supplies that he might need, as well as servants and beasts of burden to go along with him, as well as an armed escort. He had soldiers, if you will, to go with him to protect him while he was on his mission. And that brings me to the first point, mocked by the enemy, and that covers verses 1 through 3. And verse 1 reads, "But it came to pass that Sanballat heard that we builded the wall. He was wroth and took great indignation and mocked the Jews." Sanballat is first mentioned in chapter 2, verse 10, as the Horonite. Apparently, this was an influential ethnic group over which he was the leader. He became angry when he heard about the work the Israelites were doing in rebuilding the wall. He mocked and ridiculed the Jews in an attempt to discourage them. He is often mentioned in tandem with Tobiah the Ammonite. Both of these officials were disturbed when they heard that Nehemiah, the Persian king's cupbearer and advisor, had come to promote the welfare of the Israelite people. Nehemiah had King Artaxerxes' approval to build and fortify the city. A rebuilt Jerusalem was a threat to the authority of the Samaritan officials who had been in charge of the land since Judah's exile. Together, these leaders and their people constituted a formidable force against God's people. God's people can expect opposition when they're doing God's work. So if you're doing the work of the Lord, you can expect opposition. Verse 2, "And he spake before his brethren in the army of Samaria," and this is Sanballat, "and said, What do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of heaps of the rubbish which was burned?" Sanballat used his bully pulpit to influence those around him. He and his allies had scoffed at the plan to rebuild the wall when they first heard of it in chapter 2, verse 19, imagining that the effort would quickly fail. But now that actual progress was being made, he reacted in shock and indignation. In his anger, Sanballat launched into a tirade of mockery. He carried out his rant in the presence of his associates. He found it incredulous that the Israelites were making progress on their task of rebuilding the wall. And he chose mockery as a means of discouraging them. And you know, nobody likes to be mocked or made fun of. And this is what he used mockery and to discourage the people. In other words, to dissuade them from continuing the work. You know, mockery can get into your mind. And it can cause you to get discouraged. And this is what it was all about, was to discourage them so that they would not continue in the work that God had laid out for them to do. Characterizing them as feeble meant that they lacked physical strength. It meant they were too weak to complete the work or even defend themselves. Sanballat didn't know that God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in the time of trouble. and that's from Psalm 46, verse 1. His series of questions encapsulate his frustration. The implication of his questions was that they could do none of these things. He said, no, they can't do this. But God said, yes, we can. The wall was miraculously rebuilt in 52 days. Now God giveth strength, God giveth power to the faint, and to them that have no might he increases strength. Isaiah 40:29. God's enemies underestimate his power and the strength of his love for his people. When God's enemies are fighting against his people, they are in reality fighting against God. Verse 3, now Tobiah the Ammonite was by him and said, even that which they build, if a fox go up, he shall even break down their stone wall. So this was a sarcastic joke, if you will. You know, it was for them to get a few laughs at the expense of the Israelites. Tobiah the Ammonite joined in with the ridicule. He sarcastically suggested that even if a fox climbed up on the wall, he would break it down. His suggestion that the wall was so feeble that a fox could knock it down undoubtedly brought laughter to his comrades. While his remarks may have given him and his associates a good laugh, it was intended to stop the rebuilding program from going forth. It was intended to discourage the workers. But because God had a faithful man in charge, the mockery had exactly the opposite effect. The joke would be on them. If it drove Nehemiah to pray, God would have the last laugh. Nehemiah was a man of prayer, so he took it to the Lord in prayer. And that's exactly what we should do. And that brings me to the second point, the power of prayer. Verses 4 and 5. Hear, O our God, for we are despised, and turn their reproach upon their own head, and give them for a prey in the land of captivity. And cover not their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out from before thee, for they have provoked thee to anger before the builders. The best way to respond to threats is with prayer. Nehemiah was agitated and upset, and he did not hide it from the Lord. He voiced it honestly before him, not mincing words. He asked God to hear. We serve a God who hears and answers prayer. Nehemiah prayed what is known as an imprecatory prayer. It is similar to some prayers found in the Psalms. For example, Psalm 7, Psalm 74, and Psalm 79. It is not a prayer of revenge, but one for God's justice. He was seeking God's justice. He prayed that what his enemies wished for him would return upon their own heads. He prayed that they would suffer captivity such as what the Jews had experienced. Nehemiah's motive is not revenge, but rather the honor of God, who is the real object of his enemies' insults and whose purpose they do not see. You know, the enemy cannot see what the Lord is up to. Those who go against God's people and the work he has called them to do provoke God to anger. We are the spies is a description of the treatment the Israelites had gotten from the enemy, who had mocked them and made them the butt of a scornful joke. They did not deserve such disrespectful treatment. Nehemiah wanted his enemies to experience the taunts and mockery, as well as captivity that his people had endured. He wanted them to see what it was like to have the shoe on the other foot. In other words, why don't you walk a mile in my shoes? Why don't you see what I've been through? Why don't you experience the things that we have endured as a people? He did not want the mockery to go unpunished for what they had done. His plea was for God to let not their sin be blotted out from before thee. He did not want them to get away with their sin going unpunished. He wanted justice, not mercy, for his enemies. Why? Because it was for the glory of God. Notice how verse 5 concludes, they have provoked thee to anger before the builders. What the enemy did was to hinder the work of God. God's builders were doing the work he had encouraged them to do. The enemy brought discouragement to the builders with their mockery, sarcasm, and scorn, which was enough to provoke God to anger. We provoke God when we interfere with his work. The question has been asked, was Nehemiah right to utter a prayer that sounds so unloving? Jesus taught that we are to love our enemies and to pray for those who despitefully use you. Matthew 5:44. It might seem improper or unspiritual to pray against forgiveness for others. Why did Nehemiah utter such a prayer? First of all, such prayers are not absent from the New Testament. Some examples are Galatians 1, verses 8 and 9, 2 Timothy 4, verse 14, Revelation 6, verse 10. Let's consider the godly purpose behind such requests. Number one, Nehemiah was asking for immediate help in a difficult situation. If the enemy's taunts were allowed to sap the workers' morale, the work would grind to a screeching halt. Number two, the taunts of Sanballat and his crew were not harmless fun. They contained threats. Nehemiah recognized the peril and called on God to turn it back on them. Number three, the mocking did not merely make fun of the people's efforts, it impugned the honor of God. In effect, what they were saying is, your God is weak. He's so weak that he cannot or will not allow this project to continue. You know, you are a conquered people. And because you are a conquered people, your God was not strong enough to protect you. But what they didn't understand is the reason why they had gone into captivity in the first place was because of their sin. But God is also a God of grace and mercy. And when we sin, we ought to run to him and ask him for mercy, because he is the only one who can restore us. So Nehemiah was praying for God's glory to be upheld. And guess what? It's not about us, but it's all about him. And that's what Nehemiah recognized. So whatever you're going through, don't get down in your circumstance. Turn to God, because he is the only one that can restore you. He's the only one that can take care of your enemies. So don't think it's all about you, but it's all about him and what he can do in each of our lives. And then that brings me to the third point. Continue to work. Verse 6, so built we the wall, and all the wall was joined together unto the half thereof, for the people had a mind. It's in your mind. If you think you can, you can. For the people had a mind to work. The people were committed to the will of God. The enemy plays mind games and tries to discourage those who have a mind to work. The enemy wants you to stop your work for the Lord. He does not want you to do the work that God has called you to do. To walk worthy of your calling, you must have a mind to work, no matter what the enemy does to discourage you. Continue to do the work that God has called you to do. Guess what? Persecution will come when you're doing the will of God. And these people were being persecuted because of the work they were doing for the Lord. So Nehemiah's prayer was answered in the most telling way. The work went on, proving the emptiness of the enemy's taunts. The entire wall around the city was joined together, that is, linked up in a unified structure unto the half thereof. The builders managed to restore the entire wall around the city unto half its original height. So now there were no breaches in the wall, but they still had work to do because they had to build it up even higher than it was. They were united in one purpose. They had a mind to work to restore the wall. Being united in oneness, trusting in the true and living God, was the prescription for their success. They persevered and did not get discouraged while under attack from the enemy. United perseverance in God's work fights off the discouragement our enemies seek to put upon us. They want to discourage us and get us off track so that we will not do the work. And that brings me to the fourth point, angry conspiracy, and that's in verses 7 and 8. But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites, see all these people that have come together against them, heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, then they were wroth, they were angry. Verse 8, and conspired all of them together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. We don't want them to complete that wall. So we're going to unite against them to make sure that they do not complete the work. When Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabians, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's wall had gone ahead and that the gaps were closed, they were very angry. They conspired together. They conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to stir up trouble against it. Their threats, taunting, and mockery had failed to discourage the workers. The fact that the Israelites had succeeded in filling in the gaps in the wall infuriated them. They had done it despite their opposition to it. Israel's enemies now plotted and made plans to march together on Jerusalem to stop the rebuilding of the wall by force. You know, their words hadn't worked. So now they're banded together. And they said, now we'll take them by force. If our words don't work, then we'll bring together a military force and come against them. The rebuilding of the wall. So these different people groups came together to further persecute and intimidate the Jews. Since they were unable to dissuade them with their words, they conspired to use force to stop them from completing their work. Threats, confusion, and discord are tools Satan uses to hinder God's work. And that brings me to the fifth and final point. Watch and pray. Watch and pray. Verse 9, nevertheless, we made our prayer unto our God and set a watch against them day and night because of them. So in spite of what the enemy was planning to do, Nehemiah and the Israelites prayed to God and posted a watch day and night to meet the threat. Most of us have heard about the watchman on the wall. A watchman guards against enemy attack. Watchmen were posted on the wall to sound the alarm in case the enemy approached the city. The watchman had to be alert to protect against attack. We're told in verse 16 that Nehemiah divided his servants so that half were working and half were fully armed. They were on guard to protect the workers against enemy attack. Nehemiah did not panic or get discombobulated. He did the prudent thing. He prayed and posted guards on the wall day and night to thwart any enemy attack. This was a precaution that needed to be taken. So what am I saying there? I'm saying that you got to do more than just pray. You got to be wise and do what you need to do. But it all begins with prayer. So in other words, there are some things that we can do. We don't have to leave everything up to God to do for us, but there are some things that he wants us to do. He wants us to be prudent. He wants us to be wise enough to do the things that we need to do. So we defeat the devil's plan when we stay connected to God in prayer and stay alert to the enemy's schemes. Our text ends here, not letting us know the final outcome. The rebuilding of the wall was completed. The entire project took 52 days, which is less than 2 months. In the face of threats from the enemy, Nehemiah and the workers turned to God. God cared about their concerns, and he cares about ours as well. Nehemiah did the prudent thing. He set up guards 24/7 to protect his workers. The Israelites were doing God's work, and no one was going to stop them. They finished the wall with God's help. So we need to call on him when we're in trouble and even when we're not. When we are serving the Lord, we can expect both physical and spiritual opposition. Nehemiah's response was to go to God in prayer and to post a watch. Nehemiah and his fellow servants of the Lord felt the weight of persecution, but that did not stop them from obeying their calling to serve the Lord. Like Nehemiah, we should be faithful to our calling, devoting ourselves to prayer, trusting God to see us through. As with Nehemiah, we should walk worthy of our calling, even in the face of enemy persecution. And that concludes the lesson for today. And those of you who are watching online, we invite you to go into our chat room to further discuss the lesson.